It was only a wedding photograph until you zoomed in on the bride's hand and uncovered a dark secret. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Atlanta Historical Archive as Dr. Rebecca Morrison carefully studied a collection of early 20th century photographs donated by an anonymous estate, muzzle-faded portraits and formal gatherings. One image made her freeze. A wedding photograph dated 1903. A white man in a dark three-piece suit sat stiffly beside a black woman wearing an elaborate white wedding gown. Their hands were joined between them in what should have been a sign of unity. Rebecca's 15 years as a historical archivist had trained her to spot irregularities. This photograph radiated wrongness on many levels. In 1903 Georgia, interracial marriage was not only taboo, it was against the law. The state's anti-miscegenation laws, in effect since 1750, and reinforced after the Civil War, made such unions criminal acts punishable by prison. Yet, here was photographic proof of what seemed to be exactly that. She flagged the photograph for high-resolution scanning, unable to shake the disturbing feeling that held her. 2 weeks later, while reviewing the digital files, Rebecca carefully zoomed in on different details: the painted studio backdrop, the woman's jewelry, the man's hard expression. Then she focused on their linked hands. As she increased the magnification, her blood turned to ice. The bride's fingers were not simply resting. They were intentionally arranged in a distress signal, her thumb and index finger forming a subtle but unmistakable cry for help. Rebecca's hands shook as she zoomed in closer. The woman's fingers were placed with clear purpose, hidden within what appeared to be a marriage pose, but actually begging for rescue. This was not just an illegal union. It was proof of something far more sinister. A silent scream had been captured in time for 120 years, waiting for someone to finally notice it and understand its meaning. Rebecca immediately reached out to Dr. Marcus Williams, a specialist in African American history and Jim Crow-era records. When he arrived at her office that evening, she showed him the photograph without saying a word. Marcus examined it quietly, his expression growing darker. "This should not exist," he said at last. "Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws in 1903 made this impossible." Unless what? Rebecca asked, though she already feared the answer. Marcus leaned back, his face grim. Unless this was never a legal marriage. Unless this photograph records something entirely different. Coercion, captivity, or worse. Look at her face. That is not a bride's expression. That is fear barely being controlled. They spent hours studying every detail. The studio stamp read, Morrison and Wright Portrait Studio, Atlanta, Georgia, August 1903. A faint note on the back said only, Mr. Charles Whitfield and servant. Not wife, not bride. Servant. The word lingered between them like a curse. He did not even try to hide what she was to him, Marcus said softly. This photograph was never meant to show a marriage. It was meant to show ownership. Rebecca felt nauseated. But why the wedding dress? Why present it this way? Marcus searched historical records on his laptop. Control. Humiliation. Some white men during that period used their power over black women in unspeakable ways. They could not legally marry them, but they could still force them into situations that imitated marriage, a twisted performance that satisfied their desires while protecting their social status. The woman had no rights, no protection, no escape. That night, Rebecca could not sleep. She kept seeing the woman's face, her carefully arranged fingers, the silent scream that had traveled across more than a century. Who was she? What had happened to her? And most haunting of all, had anyone recognized her signal at the time, or had it remained unseen until now, far too late to help her? The next morning, Rebecca and Marcus began their investigation at the Georgia State Archives. They needed to identify both individuals in the photograph. The name Charles Whitfield became their starting point. The archivist, an elderly black woman named Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, who had worked there for 35 years, visibly stiffened when she heard the name. Charles Whitfield, she repeated slowly. That is a name that still carries weight in certain circles, though not the kind anyone should admire. She disappeared into the records room and returned with several boxes. The Whitfield family was prominent in Atlanta from the 1870s through the 1920s. They built their fortune in cotton and textiles after the war. Charles Whitfield, inherited the family business in 1898. The 1900 census listed Charles Whitfield, age 28, living in a large house on Peachtree Street with significant wealth and numerous servants recorded in his household. Rebecca's stomach tightened as she read the names. All black women and girls, ages ranging from 14 to 30. One entry caught her attention. Louisa, age 16, domestic servant, literate. Marcus located property records showing that Whitfield owned several buildings around Atlanta, including a textile factory where he employed dozens of workers, mostly black women and children, laboring in harsh conditions for very little pay. Newspaper articles from that time praised him as a progressive employer and a pillar of the community. The gap between his public image and what they were uncovering was sickening. They searched for more information about the woman in the photograph. If she had been labeled only as servant rather than by her name in the photo note, discovering her identity would be difficult. But Mrs. Hayes suggested an idea. If this photograph was taken in August 1903, check city records for missing persons reports or unusual events around that period. Sometimes families tried to report when their daughters disappeared, even though the police rarely acted. After 2 days of digging through incomplete records, Marcus found a police report from September 1903. It was short and dismissive, but it offered their first real lead. Report filed by Henry and Martha Johnson regarding their daughter Louisa Johnson, age 19, employed in the household of Charles Whitfield. Family claims she has not been seen in over a month despite living only 2 miles away. Mr. Whitfield states, Miss Johnson is fulfilling her contracted duties and is in good health. No evidence of wrongdoing. Case closed. Rebecca cross-referenced the name with the 1900 census. There she was, Louisa Johnson, age 16 in 1900, living with her parents and 3 younger siblings in a modest home, near Auburn Avenue. Her father, Henry, worked as a carpenter. Her mother, Martha, worked as a laundress. The family was literate and owned their small house. They were part of Atlanta's growing black middle class, trying to build stability despite the crushing force of Jim Crow. Marcus uncovered more records. In 1902, Henry Johnson had been injured in an accident at a construction site and could no longer work. The family slipped into debt. A note in a local church charity ledger showed they had requested help in early 1903. This is how it happened, Marcus said, his voice heavy with anger and grief. Whitfield saw an opportunity, a family in desperate need, a young woman with no choices. He offered employment, likely promised decent wages. Then they found a letter in the church records, written by Martha Johnson to the pastor in July 1903. We have not seen our Louisa in 3 weeks. Mr. Whitfield says she is well and working hard, but he will not allow us to visit her. He says it would disturb the household routine. Reverend, my heart tells me something is wrong. My daughter writes to us every week without fail, but we have received no letters. When I went to his house, the servants would not meet my eyes. Please, can you help us? The pastor's reply was recorded in his journal. Spoke with Mr. Whitfield regarding the Johnson girl. He assured me she is healthy and content, simply occupied with her duties. He expressed irritation at the family's worries and suggested they are ungrateful for his generosity in employing her. I am inclined to believe him. The Johnsons must trust in God's providence and not create trouble for a prominent gentleman who has shown them Christian charity. Rebecca traced the Morrison and Wright portrait studio records through the Georgia Historical Society. The studio had operated from 1895 to 1910, and remarkably some materials had been preserved by the photographer's descendants. She contacted James Morrison, the great-grandson of William Morrison, the studio's founder. James invited them to his home in Decatur, where he kept an extensive archive of his great-grandfather's work. William Morrison photographed Atlanta society for 15 years. James explained as he led them to his study. He kept detailed journals about his clients and his assignments. He was also quietly the son of an abolitionist who struggled with photographing the darker realities of Southern society. James removed a leather journal dated August 1903. I have read through all of these over the years. Some entries never left me. This is one of them. He opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read. August 17th. 1903. Today I carried out perhaps the most disturbing task of my career. Charles Whitfield commissioned a wedding portrait, but there was no wedding. The young Negro woman he brought to the studio was clearly not there by her own choice. She wore an expensive gown that did not fit properly, and her eyes held such deep fear that I nearly refused the commission. The entry went on. Whitfield insisted on posing them as a married couple with their hands joined. The woman, he never used her name, only called her girl, began to shake when he seized her hand. I noticed bruises on her wrists as I positioned them for the photograph. When I looked into her eyes to ensure she was facing the camera, I saw something I will never forget. She was trying to tell me something without speaking properly. I noticed a deep desperation there. She was trying hard to tell me something, but with Whitfield watching her every move, she could not speak freely. James turned the page, his voice growing tight. As I prepared the exposure, I saw her fingers shifting slightly, arranging themselves into what looked like a careful pattern, perhaps a ignal. I said nothing, but I made certain to capture it clearly. I took 3 exposures. Whitfield insisted on getting a flawless image. After they left, I felt sick to my stomach. I understood that what I had photographed was not a wedding. It was proof of something unlawful. But what could I possibly do? Report it to the police? They would have laughed at me for suggesting that a white man of Whitfield's standing had done anything improper. Marcus widened the investigation to explore Whitfield's past more thoroughly. What they uncovered revealed a long pattern of exploitation that stretched over several years. Through court files, property papers, and old newspaper archives, a disturbing story began to form. Between 1899 and 1905, at least 6 families had submitted complaints about daughters who had gone to work for Whitfield and then suddenly lost all contact with their loved ones. Every case followed a similar path. A black family struggling financially, a young woman, usually between 16 and 20, hired as domestic help. Letters sent home at first, then silence. Relatives turned away when they tried to visit. Police reports filed and quickly dismissed. In 2 cases, the young women returned months later, refusing to talk about what had happened, their spirits clearly shattered. Rebecca discovered testimony from a woman named Sarah, who had worked for Whitfield in 1901. She had given a statement to a black community organization documenting abuse by white employers, a record kept outside official systems, because official authorities refused to listen to such accusations. Mr. Whitfield kept 3 of us in the house, Sarah stated. We were never allowed to leave. He warned that if we tried, he would have our families arrested for theft or have our fathers lynched. He did whatever he wished to us. We were his property in every way except in name. The testimony. Why? Anton. There was a girl there when I arrived. She could not have been more than 16. She stayed in a room on the 3rd floor, and we were not permitted to speak with her. I heard her crying at night. After a few weeks, she was gone. Mr. Whitfield claimed she had stolen from him and run away. But I knew the truth. She would never have left. She was too terrified of what he might do to her family. I escaped only because my brother threatened to go to the newspapers. Whitfield released me rather than risk public attention. But I know the others were not as fortunate. Marcus located records proving that Whitfield had strong ties to local law enforcement and city officials. He donated regularly to political campaigns and hosted social events for Atlanta's upper class. He had complete protection, Marcus said bitterly. The system shielded him. The police answered to him, and black families had no protection at all. Their daughters could be taken, mistreated, even killed, and there was nothing they could do. Even with the darkness of these discoveries, Rebecca stayed focused on Louisa herself. The photograph showed more than suffering. It showed courage. The hand signal frozen in that image was an act of resistance, a refusal to let her captivity remain hidden. She understood, Rebecca said softly while studying the photograph again. She knew that picture might be the only proof, so she left a message behind. Through Martha Johnson's letters to various churches and organizations, they followed the family's desperate search for their daughter. In October 1903, Henry Johnson, despite his injuries, attempted to force his way into Whitfield's home. He was arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace, and spent 2 weeks in jail. The incident appeared in the newspapers, but the coverage favored Whitfield completely. Prominent businessman Haraz said by deranged relative of former employee. Martha wrote to the Atlanta chapter of the NAACP, newly established in 1903. My daughter is being held against her will by Charles Whitfield. She came to his home as an employee and is now his prisoner. I have not seen her in 4 months. She would never leave her family by choice. Please, someone must help us. We have tried every legal path, and no one will listen because we are Negro and he is white and wealthy. The NAACP responded, but their inquiry faced the same obstacles. Their lawyer, a black man named Robert Foster, tried to secure a writ of habeas corpus. The judge refused to grant it, claiming there was no proof of unlawful detention and suggesting the Johnson family was making reckless accusations against a respected citizen in an attempt to extort money. Foster recorded the case carefully, but he could not continue without risking his own safety and career. Then Marcus uncovered something surprising. A letter dated December 1903 from a white neighbor named Eleanor Hartwell, written to her sister in Boston. "There is something deeply troubling happening next door," she wrote. "Charles Whitfield has a young Negro woman in his house, whom he calls a servant. The situation seems far darker. I saw her once at an upstairs window. Her face was bruised. I tried to speak with her when Charles was away, but the other servants would not allow me inside. They seemed frightened. I am thinking about reporting this, but I fear no one will believe me or care. The trail of Louisa's story seemed to disappear after December 1903, and Rebecca feared the worst. But Marcus later discovered a record in an unexpected place, the archives of Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. In March 1904, a woman named Louisa had been admitted with serious injuries. She had been brought in by members of a black mutual aid society who found her near the E train station. The hospital record was brief but revealing. Female patient, approximately 20 years old, gave name as Louisa, but refused to give surname. Multiple injuries in different stages of healing, including broken ribs, cuts, and signs of prolonged abuse. Patient severely traumatized and barely speaks, shows intense fear of men, especially white men. Patient states she escaped from somewhere in Georgia, but refuses further details, saying he will kill my family if I speak. Rebecca's heart pounded as she continued reading. The hospital contacted a local group that helped women who had escaped both the remnants of slavery and abusive situations. A social worker named Catherine Wells took responsibility for Louisa's care. Her notes offered more insight. "This young woman has endured unimaginable trauma. She startles at sudden movement and suffers nightmares that wake the entire ward. Over several weeks, she has slowly shared parts of her story: forced confinement, repeated assaults, separation from her family, and constant threats against her loved ones if she tried to escape." Catherine's notes from April 1904 recorded Louisa's own words. "I was trapped in that house for 8 months. He took everything from me: my freedom, my dignity, my connection to my family. The photograph he forced me to take in that white dress was the worst day of all. He wanted to pretend I was his wife, that I had chosen to stay. But I made sure to leave a message in that picture. I positioned my fingers carefully, a distress sign I had read about in a book. I did not know if anyone would notice, but I had to try. I needed proof that I had not gone willingly." Records showed that Catherine helped Louisa contact her family through coded letters to avoid alerting Whitfield. In May 1904, Louisa's mother, Martha, received a message. "Mama, I am alive. I cannot tell you where I am. Only that I am safe and recovering. The man who held me believes I am dead. Please allow him to continue believing this. It is the only way to protect you, Father, and my brothers and sisters. I will write again when I can. I love you, your daughter." Marcus uncovered the final piece in Atlanta newspaper archives from March 1904. The short article reported a fire at Whitfield's residence. Authorities stated that a tragic blaze had occurred at the home of prominent businessman Charles Whitfield. One servant died in the fire. Mr. Whitfield claimed that the young Negro woman, whose name was not listed, had been careless with a cooking flame. The body was too badly burned to identify. Officials ruled it a tragic accident. However, a black newspaper called the Atlanta Independent told a different story in careful language. Sources within the Negro community report that the servant said to have died in the recent fire at the Whitfield home had actually escaped weeks earlier. Witnesses claim they saw a young woman matching a description fleeing the property in February. The fire appears to have been set deliberately to hide her escape and to frighten others who might speak out. Police declined further investigation. Louisa had escaped, and Whitfield covered it up by claiming she died in the fire. He could not admit she had gotten away without exposing the truth of her captivity. To preserve his image of respectability, he created a false death and continued his life as though nothing had happened. For the Johnson family, this meant they could never publicly admit their daughter was alive without placing her at risk. Rebecca and Marcus found letters exchanged between Martha Johnson and Catherine Wells over many years. Catherine helped Louisa build a new life in Washington, D.C., under a different name. She worked first as a seamstress and later trained to become a nurse. In 1908, she married a gentleman named Edward, a postal worker. They had 4 children together. Louisa never returned to Atlanta, and her parents had to live as though their daughter had died, keeping her survival a secret to ensure her safety. Marcus, they discovered that Louisa kept the story alive in her own quiet way. In 1925, she gave testimony to a commission that was investigating racial violence and exploitation in the South. She did not use her real name, but she shared her truth. I was 19 when a white man took me away from my family and kept me captive for 8 months. He was able to do this because the law did not protect people who looked like me. He knew no one would believe me if I spoke out. He knew my family had no power to rescue me. But I survived, and I want my story recorded so that one day, when the world is ready to listen, people will understand what happened to women like me. Rebecca and Marcus spent 6 months gathering their research into a detailed historical record. They traced Louisa's descendants through Washington, D.C. documents and located her great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Dr. Michelle Foster, who taught African American history at Howard University. When Rebecca called her, Michelle's response was immediate and deeply emotional. We had been waiting for someone to uncover this story. They met at Michelle's home, where she had carefully preserved everything Louisa had left behind. My great-great-grandmother lived until 1978, Michelle explained. She was 94 years old, and she never forgot what happened in Atlanta. She told us the story when we were old enough to understand it. She made us promise to protect it, to make sure it would never be erased. She said, "Someday someone will find that photograph, and when they do, I want them to know the full truth." Michelle showed them Louisa's personal papers, including a journal she had written in her later years. One entry said, "I have lived a good life despite what was done to me. I raised 4 wonderful children. I helped deliver dozens of babies into the world as a nurse. I loved, and I was loved, but I never forgot those 8 months, and I never forgot my parents' pain." That photograph exists somewhere, with my silent scream captured inside it. I pray that one day someone will look at it and truly understand. I pray that my story will help people see how many women suffered quietly, trapped by laws that denied our humanity, in a society that refused to acknowledge our pain. The National Museum of African American History and Culture organized an exhibition titled Silent Testimony: Louisa's Story and the Hidden History of Jim Crow Captivity. The centerpiece was the 1903 photograph displayed beside the photographer's journal, hospital records, family letters, and Louisa's own testimony. The exhibition text did not soften the truth. This photograph documents not a marriage, but a crime. It shows a young black woman being held captive by a white man who faced no punishment because the legal and social systems of Jim Crow America gave him complete protection. At the opening event, Michelle stood before the photograph with tears running down her face. Next to the 1903 image was a photograph of Louisa from 1960, at age 76, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, her expression calm and strong. "My great-great-grandmother survived," Michelle said to the gathered crowd. "She did more than survive, she rose above it. She transformed her trauma into purpose, helping other women, raising a family, creating a life filled with meaning." This photograph no longer represents only her captivity. It represents her strength, her bravery, and her refusal to disappear. Rebecca spoke to the audience. For 120 years, Louisa's signal of distress went unseen, but she left it there anyway, believing that someday someone would look closely enough to notice. Her story is not only about one woman's suffering, it is about the systematic abuse supported by racist laws and social structures. It is about the countless black women who were harmed in similar ways, with no justice available to them. And it is about the remarkable resilience of those who survived and built lives of dignity, despite everything meant to break them. As thousands of visitors walked through the exhibition in the months that followed, they saw Louisa's hand signal, read her story, and finally understood the truth that had been hidden for more than 100 years. The photograph at last fulfilled its purpose, not as proof that could save Louisa in her own time, but as a witness that refused to allow her story to vanish. Her silent scream was finally heard, and in being heard, it gave voice to countless others whose stories had been buried by history's intentional forgetting.